My name is Brigadier General Retired David Kettle. I'm the Secretary General of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission Canadian Agency. We are presently here in Brookside Cemetery, what we would call one of our iconic cemeteries because we have a large field of honor here. There are 450 war dead, both of the First and Second World War, as well as approximately 9,500 veterans of the two wars.
My name is Victoria Wallace. I'm the Director General of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. The Commission looks after the war graves of the men and women who died in the two world wars on behalf of the Allied government. It's still today maintained by the governments of Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa and India.
The Commonwealth War Graves Commission is responsible for 1.7 million war dead throughout the world. We're literally on every continent except one. I'm responsible for the Canadian agency, which takes care of the Americas, North, South, Central America, including the Falkland Islands.
It's always fascinating to come to one of the home member nations because, of course, some people just don't understand what war graves are doing in countries, particularly where there was no any enemy action on the ground. And of course, the guys who died and who are buried here quite often will have died in training accidents or while they were enlisted, but equally they could have been on the battlefields of Vimy or of Dieppe and been brought home having been injured so badly and then later succumbed to their wounds. So the stories you have buried in your cities and towns here, in the military cemeteries or even in the tiny little cemeteries, quite often tell the story of the 20th century's warfare.
First, you have to realize that the First World War, the thinking was that it was to last maybe 8 to 12 months. So not a great deal of thought was given to how they would bury or record their war dead. There was a gentleman by the name of Fabian Ware. He was far too old to enlist in the war effort, but he was well connected. And he was able to get an appointment as the leader of a mobile ambulance unit run by the Red Cross. And immediately he saw that the military had no plan for the burying of war dead. So he set about, of his own volition, to create a plan of how war dead would be treated and how their names would be recorded and where they would be placed in cemeteries, etc.
The commission was created in 1917 out of a real problem. There were, quite literally by that stage, hundreds of thousands of men who had been killed and no plan for their burials. And in an age when people had the vote, the men did anyway, and populations were being required to make enormous sacrifices for wars, rather for the first time, the commission had to do something, or the governments had to do something to, one, prevent this desperate wish of the more wealthy families to repatriate their sons from the battlefields, which would have been catastrophic in terms of morale, or at least to be able to reassure people that those men actually were being given a fit and proper burial. The Kenyon report is, I keep one on my desk, it's still as valid today as it was then. It was commissioned from the keeper of the British Museum, the director of the British Museum, and he chose Lutyens, Kipling, and other really well-placed people in the world of art and literature to consider how the dead would be buried. And they articulated this simplicity of design which would transcend all religions or none. So they eschewed the idea of crosses on graves, though the headstone as we know them today, of course, has a cross on it. If you're a Christian, you can choose to have nothing. You can choose to have any other symbol. It went as far as designing the font, determining whether or not there should be horticulture, and almost all the way around the world, there was an acceptance that gardeners would be needed to tend the lawns and make sure there were flowering shrubs in the cemeteries to make these places of reflection and peace. These men were to be honoured by name, individually and equally, and that was visionary. And they created these designs which were quite controversial at the time, but which have left us 100 years on with this extraordinary legacy of places which provided burials for the men and women who had given their lives for their country.
This is the Commission's Stone of Remembrance. There are two primary features in most Commonwealth war grave cemeteries: the Cross of Sacrifice and the Stone of Remembrance. It's a monolithic altar. It represents all religions and no religions. This is how far ahead the Commission was at that time, that it was inclusive. The inscription on the front of every Stone of Remembrance is, "Their name liveth forevermore." And this is from the book of Ecclesiastes. And this was chosen by the great author Rudyard Kipling. He had a son, John Kipling, who died during the First War, and he mourned him for the rest of his life. This is a typical war dead headstone. It has the maple leaf at the top. It's the tilted maple leaf. It's what you will generally see anywhere in Europe in one of our cemeteries there. This is achieved through sandblasting. For the war grave, the military emblem will be at the top of the headstone. Most of the war dead will have the maple leaf design. Some of the Navy, there will be the fouled anchor. For the Air Force, there would be the eagle. Underneath the military emblem is the service number, and then the name, Martin Lewis. This is his rank here. You will notice that this is a different maple leaf. The reason for this is this was chiseled by hand, but basically the same design. If we're looking to find a veteran, it's a little different in that you don't have a military symbol at the top, you have the religious symbol at the top as opposed to in the middle. Followed by rank, his name, who he served for, and he was born in 1893 and expired in 1924. So after the war years, which in the First World War's case, as far as the Commission is concerned, is 3rd of August 1914 until 30th of August 1921.
Canada is fantastic because anyone who served in the First World War qualified for a veteran's grave. And I walk along and I get really baffled by this headstone, which has got somebody who died in 1960 or even sort of 1990. But these were the men who fought alongside the guys who the Commonwealth War Graves Commission honoured at the time and have very similar graves. So there's a marvellous sense of comradeship and lifelong service that is celebrated in Canada in a way that isn't actually in other parts of the world. I see us in the long term as being the organisation that is able to hold high the torch of remembrance for those men and women and be that first point of contact which can then point them to the other stories that exist around the world. If people don't visit those sites, they become irrelevant. It doesn't matter how beautiful they are or how well kept they are. We talk a lot about keeping the memory alive, and of course, you can do that sitting in your front room reading a book about somebody. You'll learn about it. But there is nothing like that sense of place when you visit and you stand in the spot that or across the field from the place in which that man died. So we're at the most extraordinary junction, if you like, in the Commission's existence, where we're moving from an organisation which worked actively with the grieving and with the builders of the cemeteries to create this organisation, to one which is now trying to sustain that heritage and at the same time make sure that the names on the headstones and the names of the people we honour are not forgotten